The Arizona desert sun was setting behind the mountains when rancher Daniel Dan Crawford heard the frantic pounding on his front door. It was September 1898, and Dan had been living alone on his remote ranch for 5 years since his wife Elizabeth died in childbirth. The isolation suited him fine, as he preferred the quiet company of his cattle to the noise and complications of town life. Dan set down his evening coffee and approached the door cautiously. His ranch was 50 miles from the nearest settlement, and unexpected visitors usually meant trouble. The pounding came again, more urgent, this time accompanied by young voices calling for help. "Please, mister, open the door. We need help real bad. There are bad men chasing us, and we do not have anywhere else to go." Dan opened the door and found 6 boys ranging in age from perhaps 8 to 15 years old. They were dusty, exhausted, and clearly terrified. Their clothes were torn from hard travel, and all showed signs of recent injuries. Most concerning of all, they kept looking over their shoulders as if expecting pursuit. "Come in, boys." "Quickly," Dan said, stepping aside. "You look like you have been running for days." The boys stumbled into Dan's ranch house, their bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. In the lamplight, Dan could see they were all thin and malnourished. Their eyes held the hollow look of children who had seen too much hardship. "What are your names, boys?" Dan asked as he began gathering food and water. "And what kind of bad men are chasing you?" The oldest boy spoke for the group. His voice was hoarse from thirst and exhaustion. "I am Matthew Rodriguez, and I am 14 years old. This is Carlos Mendez, he is 13. That is Antonio Lopez, he is 12. The younger boy is Felipe Santos, he is 10. That one is Diego Morales. He is 9, and the little one is Pablo Gutierrez. He is 8. Dan studied their young faces, seeing the unmistakable signs of fear and desperation. "Matthew, where did you boys come from? And why are men chasing you?" Matthew glanced at his companions before answering. "We escaped from a place called Devil's Canyon 3 days ago. It is run by a man named Captain Rodriguez, who kidnaps children and makes them work in his silver mine. We tried to run away before, but he always caught us and beat us real bad." Dan felt his blood run cold. He had heard rumors of illegal mining operations in the remote desert, but nothing involving children. The idea that someone was using kidnapped boys as slave laborers was almost too horrible to believe. Carlos stepped forward. His young face showed anger mixed with fear. "Captain Rodriguez has at least 20 men working for him. They steal children from Mexican villages and from wagon trains crossing the desert. Once you go to Devil's Canyon, you never leave." Dan served the boys bread, soup, and milk while they told their story. As they ate, their terrified expressions began to soften slightly, but they remained alert for sounds of pursuit. Antonio spoke up. "We have been planning our escape for months. Captain Rodriguez was going to send some of the older boys to work in an even worse place, a mine where nobody ever comes back alive." Felipe, the 10-year-old, added, "We waited until the guards were drinking, and then we ran into the desert. We have been walking for 3 days, eating cactus, fruit, and drinking water from muddy streams." Dan looked at these 6 brave boys who had risked everything for freedom. Their courage reminded him of soldiers he had known during the Civil War who would rather die than live in slavery. "Boys," Dan said, his voice filled with determination, "you are safe here. But I need to know more about this Captain Rodriguez and his operation. How many other children are still trapped at Devil's Canyon?" Matthew's eyes filled with tears. "At least 30 boys, mister. Some as young as 6 years old. They work 12 hours a day in the mines and get beaten if they do not dig enough silver. The little ones cry for their mothers, but there is nobody to help them." Diego spoke for the first time since arriving. "Captain Rodriguez told us that if we ever tried to escape, he would hunt us down and kill us. He said nobody would ever believe that orphan boys were telling the truth about what happened to them. Dan felt rage building in his chest, the same anger he had experienced during the war when he encountered cruelty and injustice. But this was worse because it involved the systematic abuse of children who had no power to defend themselves. Pablo, the youngest, climbed onto Dan's lap seeking comfort. "Are you going to send us back to the bad men, mister? We promise we will work hard if you let us stay here." Dan wrapped his arms round the frightened child. "Pablo, nobody is going to hurt you boys while you're under my protection. But we need to figure out how to help the other children who are still trapped." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Dan immediately moved to his window and counted at least 8 riders approaching his ranch in the darkness. Even without seeing their faces clearly, he could tell they were armed and riding with hostile intent. "Boys," Dan said urgently, "those riders are probably looking for you. I want you to hide in the root cellar behind the kitchen. No matter what happens, do not come out until I tell you it is safe." The 6 boys moved quickly, showing survival skills they had learned through bitter experience. Matthew helped Pablo down into the hidden cellar while the others followed. Dan closed the wooden hatch and covered it with a rug just as heavy boots stomped onto his front porch. 3 loud knocks echoed through the house, followed by a voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to being feared. "Open up in there. We know you're awake, and we want to talk to you." Dan opened the door to find a man who could only be Captain Rodriguez himself. He was tall and lean with cold eyes, and the bearing of someone who had spent years commanding through fear and violence. 5 armed men flanked him, all looking like the type who would kill without hesitation. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" Dan asked, keeping his voice steady despite the danger he sensed. Rodriguez stepped inside without invitation, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of the fugitive boys. "We are looking for some property that belongs to us. 6 boys who ran away from our operation 3 days ago. They are dangerous and need to be returned immediately." Dan met Rodriguez's gaze steadily. "I have not seen any children. This is not exactly a place boys would wander to on their own." Rodriguez smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "The boys we are looking for are thieves and liars. They stole valuable equipment from our mining operation, and they have been spreading false stories about our business practices." "What kind of mining operation?" Dan asked. Rodriguez's expression hardened. "That is not your concern. All you need to know is that we have legal claim to those boys, and anyone who interferes with our recovery of them will face serious consequences. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible Western stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Dan realized he was facing men who would stop at nothing to recapture the 6 boys hidden beneath his floor. The children's lives depended on his ability to convince Rodriguez that they had not been here. "I will keep an eye out for any strangers," Dan said. "But as you can see, this is just a simple cattle ranch. I do not get many visitors, especially children." Rodriguez studied Dan's face, looking for any sign of deception. "We will be watching this area closely. If those boys show up here, you had better contact us immediately. The consequences of hiding stolen property can be very severe. Don't miss what happens next." Subscribe now to follow this epic Western adventure and discover how Dan and the 6 boys plan to escape Rodriguez's net and save the 30 children still trapped at Devil's Canyon. After Rodriguez and his men left, Dan helped the boys out of the root cellar. Their faces were pale with terror, but they showed remarkable courage for children who had just faced their worst nightmare. "Boys," Dan said, checking his weapons and gathering supplies, "we cannot stay here any longer. Rodriguez will be back with more men, and he will search more thoroughly next time. We need to get you somewhere safe and figure out how to help the other children." Matthew looked at his companions, then back at Dan. "Where can we go, mister?" Rodriguez has men everywhere, and he knows this desert better than anyone. Dan was already formulating a plan that would require all his frontier skills and military experience. There is a town called Tucson, about 100 miles south of here. They have a federal marshal who might be able to help us, but getting there alive will be the biggest challenge of our lives. Dawn brought no relief from the desert heat as Dan and the 6 boys prepared for their dangerous journey to Tucson. Dan had spent the early morning hours making copies of a crude map he had drawn showing the location of Devil's Canyon based on the boys' descriptions. If something happened to them on the trail, at least the evidence of Rodriguez's crimes might survive. The boys had proven remarkably resilient despite their recent ordeal. Matthew took responsibility for organizing their limited supplies while Carlos and Antonio helped Dan prepare the horses. The younger boys Felipe, Diego, and Pablo showed courage that impressed the veteran rancher. We need to reach Seguro Springs by evening, Dan explained as they mounted their horses. It is the only reliable water source between here and Tucson. If Rodriguez's men catch us in the open desert, we will not have a chance. The first day of travel passed without incident as they made their way through remote canyons and hidden valleys that few people ever visited. The boys proved to be excellent riders despite their youth, showing skills they had learned during their captivity. Carlos rode beside Dan as they navigated a particularly treacherous section of trail. "Mr. Crawford, what happens when we reach the marshal in Tucson? Will he believe what we tell him about Captain Rodriguez?" Dan had been wondering the same thing. "Carlos, the stories you boys have to tell are so horrible that some people might not want to believe them. But a federal marshal has seen enough evil in his career to recognize the truth when he hears it." On the second day, Antonio, who had been scouting their back trail, returned with disturbing news. "There are riders following U.S. Mr. Crawford. At least 6 men, and they are closing the distance fast." Dan studied the pursuing riders through his field glasses. Rodriguez had apparently organized a search party and was tracking them with the determination of someone who could not afford to let witnesses escape. "We need to reach Devil's Rock before they catch us," Dan decided. "There are caves there where we can make a stand if necessary." The chase that followed tested everyone's endurance and riding skills. Dan's horses were strong, but their pursuers knew the desert intimately and were riding fresh mounts. The gap between the two groups was steadily closing as they raced across the barren landscape. Felipe, despite being only 10 years old, kept up, with the older boys showing determination that reminded Dan of seasoned cavalry troopers. Behind them they could hear the sounds of pursuit growing closer with each passing hour. Devil's Rock appeared ahead like a fortress rising from the desert floor. Dan led the boys up a narrow trail to a series of caves that would provide defensive positions and protection from the brutal sun. Matthew helped Pablo climb to safety while the other boys took positions behind rocks that would shield them from gunfire. Dan checked his weapons, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether they lived or died. The confrontation came when Rodriguez and 5 armed men reached the base of Devil's Rock. The bandit leader was clearly frustrated by the chase, and his voice carried across the desert air with threatening authority. "Crawford, we know you have our property up there. Send down those boys, and we might let you live." Dan's response was a rifle shot that sent Rodriguez diving for cover behind a boulder. The message was clear. There would be no negotiation and no surrender of the children. The siege that followed lasted through the afternoon heat. Rodriguez's men tried several times to climb the narrow trail, but Dan's superior position allowed him to keep them pinned down. The boys helped by rolling rocks down on anyone who tried to approach. As evening approached, Rodriguez called out again. "You cannot stay up there forever, Crawford. We have water and supplies. You and those boys will die of thirst if you do not surrender." Dan knew Rodriguez was partly right. Their water would not last more than another day in the desert heat. But he also knew that surrendering meant death for all of them. Carlos crawled over to where Dan was positioned. "Mr. Crawford, there is another way out of these caves. A passage that leads down the back side of the rock. We could escape while Rodriguez's men are watching the front." Dan studied the young boy's face. "Carlos, that passage would put us right back in the open desert with no horses and limited water. It would be almost certain death." Carlos met Dan's gaze with determination that belied his 13 years. "Maybe for us, mister. But if we stay here, we all die for sure. At least if some of us get away, we might be able to tell people about the other boys still trapped at Devil's Canyon." Dan looked at the 6 brave faces surrounding him. These children had already risked everything to escape from slavery, and they were willing to risk their lives again to save their friends. The escape attempt began after midnight when Rodriguez's men had settled into their siege. Positions. Dan led the boys through the narrow cave passage that Carlos had discovered emerging on the back side of Devil's Rock under cover of darkness. The journey across the open desert tested their endurance to the limit. Without horses, they had to walk through sand and rocks under the scorching sun, carrying only the water they could fit in their canteens. Diego, the 9-year-old, began to falter on the second day, at Pablo despite being the youngest. Encouraged his friend to keep going. The bond between the boys reminded Dan of the brotherhood he had known among soldiers who faced death together. On the third day, they saw Tucson in the distance like a merge shimmering in the heat. The boys found new strength, knowing that safety and justice were finally within reach. Federal Marshal William Hayes proved to be everything Dan had hoped. He was a man of perhaps 50 years with gray hair and the steady eyes of someone who had spent his career fighting injustice. When Dan presented their story, Hayes listened with growing anger. "This is the most comprehensive account of organized child slavery I have ever encountered," he said after hearing the boys' testimonies. "Mr. Crawford, these children have provided evidence of crimes that demand immediate federal intervention." Matthew stepped forward, speaking for all of them. "Marshal Hayes, can you save the 30 boys still trapped at Devil's Canyon? They do not know that anyone is coming to help them." Hayes' expression hardened with determination. "Son, we are going to rescue every child mentioned in your account. More than that, we are going to destroy Rodriguez's entire operation and make sure he never harms another child. Don't miss the next chapter of this epic Western adventure. Subscribe to our channel to follow this dangerous rescue mission and discover whether the federal authorities can reach Devil's Canyon before Rodriguez moves or kills the remaining children. The boys' ordeal was far from over, but for the first time since their escape they had hope. A federal marshal with the authority and resources to act was preparing to bring justice to the remote desert where 30 innocent children waited for salvation. They did not even know was coming. Marshal Hayes wasted no time organizing a federal response to the boys' testimony. Within 24 hours, he had assembled a force of 12 deputy marshals and territorial cavalry troopers who specialized in desert operations. The rescue mission would be dangerous, but Hayes was determined to reach Devil's Canyon before Rodriguez could move or harm the remaining children. Dan and the 6 boys insisted on accompanying the rescue party despite Hayes' concerns about their safety. Matthew spoke for all of them when he argued that they were the only ones who knew the exact layout of Rodriguez's mining operation and the location where the children were being held. "We know every guard position and patrol route," Matthew told Hayes. "The other boys will trust us when we tell them help has arrived. Without us, you might not be able to find them all in time." Hayes studied the determined faces of the 6 young survivors. Against his better judgment, he agreed to let them come along as guides, but only if they promised to stay back during any fighting. The journey to Devil's Canyon took 2 days through some of the harshest desert country in Arizona. territory. The boys proved invaluable as guides showing the federal force hidden water sources and safe passages that cut hours off their travel time. Carlos rode beside Marshal Hayes as they approached the outskirts of Rodriguez's operation. There are always guards posted on the high rocks round the canyon entrance. They will see us coming from miles away unless we approach from the blind side. Hayes studied the terrain through his field glasses. Carlos, you and your friends know this country better than my men do. What do you recommend? Antonio joined their planning session. There is a dry creek bed that runs along the eastern wall of the canyon. It is deep enough to hide horses and men until we get close to the mine entrance. Dan felt proud of these remarkable boys who had transformed from terrified fugitives into tactical advisors helping to plan the rescue of their friends. Their courage and knowledge would be crucial to the mission's success. The assault on devils canyon began at dawn, when the guards would be least alert. He's divided his force into 3 groups. One would create a diversion at the main entrance, while the others moved to secure the children and capture Rodriguez. The boys led the rescue teams through passages they had memorized during their captivity showing. Federal marshals exactly where the 30 captive children were being held. What they found in the underground chambers broke the hearts of even hardened lawmen. Children as young as 6 years old were chained in conditions that could only be described as dungeons. They were malnourished, exhausted, and showed signs of systematic abuse that spoke 2 months or years of exploitation. Felipe called out softly to the terrified children huddled in the darkness. "It is okay. We brought help. These men are federal marshals, and they are here to take you home." The response was immediate as children who had given up hope suddenly realized that rescue had finally come. Some wept with relief, while others could hardly believe that their nightmare was ending. The battle above ground was brief but decisive. Rodriguez's men were caught completely off guard by the coordinated federal assault. Most surrendered immediately when they realized they were facing U.S. Marshals rather than local law enforcement that could be bought or intimidated. Rodriguez himself was captured trying to escape with a saddlebag full of silver and gold that represented years of stolen labor by enslaved children. His reign of terror in the Arizona desert was finally over. The aftermath of the rescue revealed the full scope of Rodriguez's criminal empire. Federal investigators found records showing that he had kidnapped and enslaved more than 200 children over the past 5 years. Most had been worked to death in his illegal mining operations. But 30 children were saved, and that was worth celebrating. The rescued boys ranged in age from 6 to 16 years old and came from Mexican villages, wagon trains, and even American towns where they had been snatched from orphanages or poor families. Diego ran to embrace friends he had not seen since. Their escape attempt, the reunion of children who had protected each other through unimaginable hardship, brought tears to the eyes of hardened federal marshals. Marshal Hayes coordinated with authorities in Mexico and throughout the American Southwest to reunite the rescued children with surviving family members. For those who had no families left, carefully screened adoptive homes were found with people who genuinely wanted to provide love and care. Pablo, the youngest of the original 6 escapees, was adopted by Marshal Hayes himself, who discovered that his wife had been longing for children of their own. The other 5 boys were taken in by Dan Crawford, who found that his remote ranch became much less lonely with the sound of children's laughter filling the air. Subscribe now to our channel for more epic Western stories that celebrate the triumph of good over evil. The trials that followed Rodriguez's capture exposed a network of corruption that reached into multiple territories. The bandit leader was sentenced to life in prison, while his accomplices faced lengthy terms for their roles in the kidnapping and exploitation of children. Most importantly, laws were strengthened throughout the Southwest to provide better protection for vulnerable children and to ensure that federal authorities could respond quickly to reports of child trafficking or slavery. Dan Crawford never regretted opening his door to 6 desperate boys who not seeking shelter. Instead, he discovered that his greatest purpose in life was not ranching cattle, but raising children who had survived horrors that would have broken many adults. The boys grew up to become productive citizens who never forgot the importance of standing up for those who could not protect themselves. Several became lawmen themselves, dedicating their careers to fighting the kinds of crimes they had survived. Devil's Canyon was permanently closed, and its silver mines were sealed to prevent anyone from ever again using them as places of exploitation. A monument was erected there bearing the names of all the children who had died in Rodriguez's operation, ensuring that their sacrifice would never be forgotten. This Western story reminds us that heroes come in all ages, that courage can triumph over cruelty, and that sometimes the most important thing we can do is open our door to those seeking shelter from the storms of life. It proves that family is defined by love and protection rather than blood, and that justice sometimes requires ordinary people to do extraordinary things.